Hi, good evening, everyone. It's nice of you to take the time to come out in this nasty weather and braving the streets and the traffic to come here tonight. So I want to extend a very, very warm welcome to all of you. I'm Helen Hayward, and I'm a member of the public representing all your voices at the board of Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. And some of you, I've seen some familiar faces, so you're probably frequent attendees to the public education series. So Stephen and others, so welcome and nice to see you again. And for some of you who have not been here for the first time, we welcome you and hope to see you more often. Every spring, every April, we host a discussion on cancer. And my mother happened to pass away on early April, a few years ago. And every April is always daffodil selling time in terms of the months, April being Cancer Month. So I always have a soft spot in my heart for April to talk about cancer and all the innovations that come along with that. Tonight, as you know, many of us with family members, friends, as well as even ourselves might have had personal impact in terms of having a cancer diagnosis and what it brings, and learning and understanding how to manage some of these issues. Receiving a cancer diagnosis can no doubt be a life-changing moment, and is a new reality that many Canadians are living with every single day. According to Cancer Care Ontario, more than 90,000 people will be diagnosed in this province this year alone. There is a lot to consider and work through: the emotional aspects, the treatment considerations, the family dynamics, and a lot of uncertainty. How will you know what to do next? Every patient's journey will be different, but we hope with tonight's discussion to focus on some common themes that can help you or a loved one. They include overcoming the trauma of a cancer diagnosis, living your life beyond cancer, and the relational aspects of cancer and caregiving. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Calvin Law here again this evening to moderate the discussions and offer his guidance throughout the talks. Dr. Law is the chief of Odette Cancer Center. He's also a surgical oncologist with a focus on, I may not pronounce this right, hepatobiliary, pancreatic, and gastrointestinal malignancies. I don't know how long his business card title is, so he has a subspecialized practice in neuroendocrine tumors. As the co-founder of the Susan Leslie Multidiscipline somebody has to change the speech for me, Neuroendocrine Tumors Clinic. He takes an active part in the treatment of patients with those tumors. In addition to these roles and his work in cancer research, Dr. Law is also the Vice President for Regional Cancer Services here at Sunnybrook. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Law to the podium to get the discussions underway this evening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Tonight's really going to be fun, and the speakers that we have are really the most amazing part of tonight. Just want to welcome everybody here and those on the webcast. Those of you who came here in your snowshoes mounted to rain boots should get special prizes, like a true Canadian. Anyways, but I think we're going to have a wonderful, wonderful evening. So again, thank you, Helen. And we've got a few things we want to tell you about tonight. So first, just know that the webcast, although we're transmitting it live, is also archived so that you can see not just tonight's talk, but a whole bunch of other talks, and that can be accessed through the Speaker Series homepage. Now tonight, we called this Cancer, Now What? Partly because I've been with you before to talk about radiating things, giving chemotherapy to things, and even operating on things, but there's another pillar in your care and in your journey that I think we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to leave it to our speakers to really share some really important points with all of you. All right? Now, during their presentations, you're going to think of questions. So write them down on the card that you might be have right in front of you or on your seat, or you're sitting on them. Those little white cards, we'll be collecting them, and then we're going to try our very best to organize them and get through them tonight. And I also wanted to point out that there's a wonderful resource here for questions that you might have on other nights. That is with Paul Taylor, who is a former journalist that now works with us and writes this amazing blog that's really designed to help answer our patients' questions, and he sort of connects all the people that needs to help you answer it all together and puts it in this blog. So that's his email, and again, we'll put it up toward the end. And any questions we don't get to tonight, we'll be passing over to Paul as well. All right. Now, before we get to the talks, also, as you go, there's an evaluation form, which I have to say is very, very precious to us, because we want this is about you tonight. You know, we came here to try and give you interesting information, to try and address many of your concerns. So any suggestions and thoughts you have, please put them on those evaluations. Those are really, really important to us and very, very valuable, and we'll be collecting them at the end. Please note also that we welcome you any time during the talk. Since it's a long evening we're going to spend together, if you need to go to the bathroom or get a refreshment or anything, please go up, and don't worry, it's a nice, friendly place, and just come in and out as you need. So that being said, we always ask that if you have a cell phone, it'd be nice to have that on quiet, or to just take it outside. Now, we're going to get started with our first speaker that I'm really excited to introduce. Dr. Ellie Eisenberg-Rosetta is a psychiatrist here at Sunnybrook. He's modest enough not to give out any other information on this introduction, but I can't tell you how much he means to our patients. I think sometimes we forget just how much impact all the care our patients go through. And I know Ellie has been with many of our patients who come back and say that the biggest difference that has been made for them is through Dr. Eisenberg-Rosetta. So on that note, Ellie, I'm going to call you up here to get us started.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'm Ellie Eisenberg-Rosetta. I'm a psychiatrist, and as Cal was mentioning, I work at the Odette Cancer Center, and my subspecialty area is psycho-oncology. So the part of psychiatry that I work in is really in helping people adjust to a diagnosis of cancer. I help cancer patients, I help their families, and sometimes I help the oncologists as well when they're sort of struggling with some of the issues. It's a real big honor for me to be here tonight, so thanks for having me. What I was asked to talk about tonight is the idea of overcoming the trauma of a cancer diagnosis. And originally the title had a period at the end of it, and then I changed it to a question mark. And really it was for the purpose of hopefully stimulating some thought, and in particular stimulating some thought about this idea of whether it's even possible to truly overcome the trauma of a cancer diagnosis and what that actually means. And so moving right along, the objectives that I want to try to hit tonight are to answer a few questions. Number one, what is trauma? What do we actually mean by diagnosis of trauma or experience of trauma? Number two, is it possible to grow from a traumatic experience, in particular from a traumatic experience like cancer? And number three, what does overcoming the trauma of cancer actually mean? And so hopefully at the end of the next maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so, we'll be able to answer some of these questions at least. So to begin, what is trauma? So in general, trauma is an event, an experience that people live through that is highly stressful. It's often thought about as crisis or adversity. And classically speaking, we tend to think about trauma as coming about through times of war, maybe violence, sometimes sexual violence, sometimes car accidents, natural disasters. And there's been a push in the medical field to try to expand that definition to the experience of going through a severe illness, including cancer. And so it's not just something like a wartime event, but a traumatic event can be something that is stressful, like a diagnosis of cancer. The event itself isn't the trauma. The trauma is actually experiencing the event and the way in which the event might actually threaten part of our core beliefs about the world and about ourselves in the world. So most of us, many of us, probably in Western cultures at least, have certain beliefs about how the world is supposed to function, how we are supposed to be within the world. So I put some examples up there. For example, the self is basically good and we're essentially in control, sometimes invulnerable. The world is a just place, a benevolent place, and a place that's filled with meaning. And that there's a logical coherence to life, that consequences logically follow actions. And so a traumatic event is not just the event itself, but it's an event that also rattles the foundations of our world. And it makes us really question some of these core beliefs that, until the trauma, that typically we have. Yanoff Bowman and Irene Fries and Ronnie Yanoff Bowman are trauma researchers, and they came up with a great quote. They say, "When tragedy strikes, our fundamental assumptions are shattered, our protective illusions are destroyed, and survivors are forced to confront their own vulnerability and fragility." And I think that really sums up, in really poetic language, what it means to experience trauma. So how do we actually experience trauma? So in general, we experience it through an intense emotional response. Often that's what we would consider distress, emotional distress, or intrapsychic distress, an unpleasant emotional experience. Often that's accompanied by physical symptoms. And so people who are experiencing a trauma either during or after can sometimes feel, they might feel their heart racing. They might find that it's hard to breathe. They might find themselves a little sweaty or tremulous. They might shake or feel, trembly inside. Often traumas come with intrusive thoughts, and so these are thoughts that can be either re-experiencing the trauma itself. So in the case of a cancer diagnosis, it might be intrusive thoughts of when that diagnosis was given and the words that were used. It might be recollections or reminders of what it was like to either hear that or to experience some of the after effects of the cancer. And avoidance. Avoidance is often one of the behaviors or experiences that people have in relation to a trauma. You can imagine an experience that causes that much emotional distress. It's sort of a natural human reaction to try to avoid that emotional distress. And so often during or after the trauma, our brains are kind of overloaded with a mixture of all of these, the intense emotions, the physical symptoms, the intrusive thoughts, and the need or want to avoid. In general, if we were to look at a timeline for what actually happens when we experience a trauma, so the arrow that you're seeing is basically a timeline with time moving forward towards the right of the screen. If we experience a trauma represented there by the sort of lightning bolt, typically what happens after is this up and down of all of those intrusive thoughts, physical symptoms, the want or need to avoid, the intense emotional response. And often what the brain does is it sort of goes back and forth, and what the body does is it kind of goes back and forth, kind of vacillating between having intrusive thoughts, wanting to avoid them, feeling an intense emotional response, wanting to avoid that. And there really is this sort of up and down that happens, again, during or shortly after a trauma. Typically, it's the going back and forth between intrusive thoughts and avoidance that actually eventually allows us to have some sort of resolution. And so that's why you'll notice after all of that up and down, eventually the arrow kind of straightens out again, and hopefully people resume to life as before to some extent. Sometimes when this process doesn't happen, or isn't allowed to happen, or there's some sort of failure in the process of it itself, that's when people can develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And that would be, you'll notice the dotted arrow basically kind of spiraling down. That's when we fail to go back to baseline or resume life as we lived it before, and instead people can be plagued by symptoms that continue well after the trauma itself has resolved or ended. And on the flip side, another potential outcome is what we call post-traumatic growth. And this is the process of actually growing in a variety of different ways following a trauma. It's when we somehow end up being more developed, in some ways better than we were before the trauma. And so there are really three sort of broad categories of outcomes that can happen. One is that we can resume life as normal. Another is that people can develop post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. And the third, and the one that we hope for, is that people can somehow grow or further develop in a sort of personal way, or maybe even a community type of way from the trauma itself. So in what ways do people grow? So I listed some of the themes that we tend to see in folks who have grown, who've experienced post-traumatic growth following a trauma. In general, we tend to see 5 themes, and I'll go through them and give an example or two from each one. So the first one is a greater appreciation of life and a changed sense of priorities. So often patients will tell me that their sense of priorities are changed after a diagnosis of cancer. It's actually fairly common that I hear that. Sometimes people will talk about their jobs not having felt that important to them beforehand, and now coming to that realization, or maybe wanting to focus more on other aspects of their life, developing relationships, developing other skills, or sort of following a dream that maybe they hadn't beforehand. Things like volunteering, community service, writing, maybe traveling. People also sometimes talk about not sweating the small stuff, and that's really a reflection of this idea of changing priorities. The second theme that we tend to hear about is that people experience warmer and more intimate relationships with others than they did before the trauma. And you'll notice that there's overlap really between all of these, but often people will tell me about the deepening of their relationships, again with maybe kids, maybe with a spouse, maybe with parents, maybe with close friends. Sometimes people will say that now they realize who their real friends are. You know, again, sort of overlap with having different senses of priorities, is that through a trauma, through the aftermath of it, and through post-traumatic growth, sometimes people do start to experience their friendships in different ways. It's not to say that it will happen with all of their friendships, but sometimes there's sort of a narrowing and yet a deepening of some of the remaining friendships that they have. A third theme that comes up a lot is a greater sense of personal strength. And this one is sort of self-evident. Often people will tell me that having been through, you fill in the blank, having been through whatever type of cancer, they now know that they can deal with pretty much anything. And there really is a sense that there's an inner strength that maybe they had the whole time, but didn't necessarily realize that they had. The fourth theme is the recognition of new possibilities or paths in one's life. And again, there's obvious overlap with some of the other themes, but this ties in you know, a lot to theme number one. People do tell me that sometimes they've left their career that again wasn't so rewarding or fulfilling in search of doing more meaningful or different work. And actually sometimes whether or not they do leave their job or change careers, at least recognizing that there are other possibilities out there is one of the ways that we see this theme enacted. And so the fifth theme that comes up, again, often not all the time, is spiritual development. And this isn't necessarily a religious concept. I mean, it can be for some people who are religious, but the idea of spiritual growth extends well beyond religion, or has the potential to. People might feel that they're more connected with religion, but they also might feel that they're more connected with the world and others in a sort of bigger than they are spiritual kind of way. And so these 5 themes are really not that uncommon. It's not that we'll hear about all 5 of these themes from every individual that we work with, but these are the sort of broad spectrum of themes that come up in folks who have experienced post-traumatic growth. I'm going to show you a quote from Hamilton Jordan. He was the chief of staff for Jimmy Carter, and he wrote a book called No Such Thing as a Bad Day. And there's a quote here that really, I think, sums up these themes really quite nicely. After my first cancer, even the smallest joys in life took on a special meaning. Watching a beautiful sunset, a hug from my child, a laugh with Dorothy. That feeling has not diminished with time. After my second and third cancers, the simple joys of life are everywhere and are boundless. As I cherish my family and friends and contemplate the rest of my life, a life I certainly do not take for granted. And so post-traumatic growth, again, really is the idea of personal growth that comes out through the trauma or through the aftermath of the trauma. And so it's not a zero-sum game. It's actually, in certain aspects of life, ending off better or more developed than one was beforehand. What it's not is, it's not resilience, it's not hardiness. These are concepts that actually sometimes prevent people from experiencing post-traumatic growth. You know, resilience is really the ability to resist major stressors in life, and you know, the whole concept of post-traumatic growth is that people need to experience the trauma in its fullest way in order to then grow from it. And so resilience is great and hardiness is great. But often, in large studies at least, those are factors that are shown to sometimes prevent people from being able to experience post-traumatic growth. And optimism sometimes is shown in some studies to be a factor that also prevents people from experiencing post-traumatic growth. Now, the jury's sort of out. There are other studies that show that optimism is actually related to post-traumatic growth. But the idea here, and optimism, you know, we think about it as the expectation that good things are going to happen, that positive things are going to happen, sometimes even in spite of evidence to the contrary. And so you can imagine that, again, that could be something that might prevent people from actually experiencing the fullest extent, the most distress from a cancer diagnosis or its aftermath, and in that way might actually prevent people from experiencing post-traumatic growth. But again, the jury's out on that one. So just to sort of attach a kind of pictorial view to this, so essentially on the x-axis here, the horizontal line, if we think about different degrees of trauma, we can imagine that you can experience such a huge trauma that it might actually overwhelm the senses in such a way that it overwhelm the cognitive capacity in such a way that people actually can't experience post-traumatic growth. That's PTG up there on the y-axis. You can imagine also that for people who don't experience enough of a trauma, then that experience wouldn't allow them to have post-traumatic growth on the other side. And so there is kind of this middle ground where people need to experience enough of a trauma, but not so much that it really overwhelms the senses or the cognitive capacity to then develop post-traumatic growth. So what's actually happening in this process? Well, if we start with the trauma, and again, that leads to emotional distress, or has the potential at least to lead to kind of the disruption of one's core beliefs about the world and about themselves and how the world is supposed to work, their life narrative, so to speak, becomes disrupted. Well, what follows from that is what we call rumination. And sometimes we talk about this idea of anxious or depressive rumination. It's thinking, 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 overthinking. This rumination is a little bit different. This is the idea of having those intrusive thoughts and then having them go away, and sort of this back and forth between reminders and rethinking about the trauma or the aftermath, and then taking a break from it. And this real challenging process, cognitive process that happens. Probably early on, what happens is these are automatic ruminations, kind of out of people's control, and equally distressing. And eventually, as time goes on, the rumination becomes a bit more controlled, a bit more deliberate. And people can actually think about this on their own terms in a way that allows them to hopefully grow, maybe by rewriting their story, the life narrative that was disrupted. So, rumination, well, so kind of the sort of the easiest way to understand it is thinking and overthinking, and sort of being just absorbed in overthinking, in a sort of dwelling is a way to think, is a way to understand it. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a great word. So, so the process of rumination happens alongside, hopefully, self-disclosure and social support. And not just any self-disclosure, but self-disclosure with the right people. And usually when it comes to traumas and to post-traumatic growth, the right people are peers. This is why support groups are so helpful for people. It's because there is something about having a shared experience. Not that the trauma itself was the same, but that the experience of being traumatized is often one that other people who've been in that situation can relate to. And so self-disclosure, it's interesting, some studies actually show that extroverts, people whose personalities are more open, actually experience more post-traumatic growth, or at least an easier time getting there. And it's for that very reason. It's because being open and being able to self-disclose about the experience that's been lived through is one of the ingredients that goes into post-traumatic growth. Of course, social support is another really important aspect. And I would never say, don't talk to your families. I mean, of course, family members are there, and supportive families are so necessary, but there is something that can be gained from a support group with peers that really can't be gained elsewhere. And so in this process that goes on and on and on, and can take months or years sometimes, hopefully what happens is that people actually recreate a narrative. And the narrative isn't, I got my body back, my healthy kidney is now back in my body somehow, or that brain tumor is no longer in my brain, or it's not the narrative, because that's not reality. But hopefully the narrative is that as long as I'm alive and kicking, I'm able to do the thing that I've always done, which is to be somebody who connects to people, who has value, and who can make meaning in life, and who can create a narrative where life is meaningful and purposeful. And sure, it'll look different than it was before, but being able to recreate that narrative is what actually leads to post-traumatic growth. It's not to say that distress goes away, and this is part of why I put that question mark on the title page. I don't think that's necessarily a realistic goal. And you can imagine, some of the worst traumas that people could experience. You'd sort of wonder, well, how could distress ever fully go away? We can think about parents losing children, and I don't know that any of them ever would say that their distress is gone, or fully gone, or always gone. And so that's not actually one of the goals of post-traumatic growth. The purpose, the function of post-traumatic growth is to be able to actually live with these dichotomies. The dichotomies being that there's cancer and that life still has meaning, and recreating a narrative in that way. You can see that box on the bottom right-hand corner is wisdom. And this is the sort of thing that people often at a ripe old age develop. And they develop it either through having lived through big traumas or sometimes many traumas. And actually, when we look at traumas and post-traumatic growth, people who experience the most post-traumatic growth are often younger people. And the reason is simply because older folks often have already been through life. They've seen life. They've seen that life can be awful to people sometimes. And so the experiences themselves are less apt to cause that same amount of distress and that same process as they might cause in someone who's younger. So these are some of the outcomes. I mean, we've basically talked about all of these: developing wisdom about life, being able to balance action and reflection, reflective thought, weighing things, weighing the unknowns and the knowns in life, accepting the paradoxes of life, and contemplating questions of human existence. These are some of the outcomes. So you'll notice that decreasing distress isn't on that list. It's not one of the outcomes, nor could it be for a trauma that was great enough. So maybe a final quote. This is from a book by Harold Kushner. He's an Orthodox, Jewish Orthodox rabbi, a modern Orthodox. And his son died at, I think, age 12, if I remember correctly. And that entire experience basically made him question his fundamental beliefs about life and about the world, which for him, given his background, highly centered around God and Judaism. And it's an excellent read. It's one of the few interventions, if we're going to call it that, that I will freely prescribe to somebody without actually knowing them all too well. I have yet to see it do damage. So I'll read you a quote from his book. He says, "I'm a more sensitive person, a more effective pastor, a more sympathetic counselor because of Aaron's life and death than I ever would have been without it. And I would give up all of those gains in a second if I could have my son back. If I could choose, I would forego all of the spiritual growth and depth which has come my way because of our experiences, but I cannot choose." And so that, I really think, sums up what we hope for people to gain through something like post-traumatic growth. The idea that bad things happened and we can't undo that. And given that they've happened, there may still be a way for somebody to grow and find life meaningful and purposeful nonetheless. Thanks.
Ooh. Powerful stuff. Thanks, Ellie. I'm sure writing all those questions down as you think about it. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Her name is Angela Leahy. She's been one of our nursing team members for years, and now our basically key leader in cancer nursing for the entire program. She's led our breast site activity. She's been our professional lead, and now she's manager for all the cancer nurses in our inpatient and outpatient wards. So we're very fortunate to have her this evening to talk about living life beyond cancer. Angela?
All right, so good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Calvin, for the introduction, and a special thank you to the Planning Committee for having me come speak this evening. So I've been an oncology nurse for well over 20 years now, and I've spent a good part of the last 10 years focusing on what has become a passion of mine, and that's really helping patients deal with their life following cancer diagnosis and cancer treatment, and really helping them move beyond the cancer. Now, I'll be full disclosure, the majority of that work has been with breast cancer patients. However, it's easy to generalize a lot of what I've learned through these patients and through the work that I've done to anybody who's gone through this experience. And I recognize that in the audience, you could be someone that's had a cancer diagnosis yourself. You may be with a loved one or with a friend that has gone through the experience as well. So as we get started, I just want to talk about a term called cancer survivor. And just a quick show of hands, how many in the audience have heard this term? Yeah, just about everyone, okay. It's a term that some people like, and it's a term that some people don't like. The thing is, we're in a stage of cancer now where more and more people are surviving cancer, and that's a wonderful thing. They're living many, many years after their diagnosis and having had treatment. And survivor means different things to different people. Some organizations are defining survivor right at the point when you're first diagnosed with cancer. Other organizations are considering it sort of as you're moving through the treatment phase. And I would say the majority of the organizations that I have reviewed and have dealt with over the years, including the work that I've done with patients, has really focused on this area, sort of when that active cancer treatment has finished, in through recovery and onwards. And that's kind of where I'm going to be talking about that area for tonight's discussion. Several years ago, I did a research project with a colleague of mine, Sharon, and we talked to a number of cancer patients, primarily those with breast cancer, and we asked them what life was like for them for anywhere from 1 month to 1 year following the end of their active cancer treatment. We'll talk about what active cancer treatment means. One of the quotes that resonated the most with me and really set the stage for the name of my entire program, Now What? Life After Breast Cancer, was a quote from one of our patients that said, "Because now the treatment's over for me, I feel like now what? I feel a little lost. Lost because all of a sudden I don't have the doctors, I don't have the nurses or the technicians anymore. It's like, okay, you're now out there on your own, and that's what I feel." And many, many people have said to me that they have felt that once that sort of active treatment ended, they felt a little bit like they were dropped off the edge of the cliff and weren't really sure what was coming next. So tonight I'm going to provide just an overview of some of the common themes that have come out of my work with patients dealing with life after cancer, and really highlight the importance of moving beyond that diagnosis into healthy living and wellness. We're going to talk about some common things that come up all the time around your new normal, dealing with long-term effects from cancer treatment, that fear of cancer coming back, talk about follow-up care and what exactly that means. We're going to talk a little bit about the highlights around healthy living and wellness, and just cover off a few key resources. Now that's a pretty hefty list, given I've got about 15 minutes to speak. So I'm going to be just touching on some of these key areas. I think the key to recognize is it's normal to not feel normal. And that's one of the #1 things that gets brought up every single time. I've met with over 450 patients where I've provided education and sort of some counseling, if you will, around making that bridge from having completed treatment and how to move beyond. And normal has a different meaning for everyone in this room. Many do not feel the way they do after cancer treatment as to how they felt before. And I think it's important to recognize that your body and yourself go through a lot. You go through a lot of intense treatment trauma, as Dr. Ellie talked about, with regards to having had your diagnosis. And the one thing I find from many people is they say that the minute that treatment ended, everyone around them expected them to be right back to their old self, whether it's the children, the spouse, the neighbors, and we know that that's often not the case. We know it takes time. We recognize that some never feel the way they did before they were diagnosed afterward, for better or for worse. And many talk about the common challenges they have and the fear about the future and what it holds. When we talk about your new normal, we're talking about the physical changes you might experience as well as the emotional changes. There's a whole array of emotions that came through in the research that we did. Anxiety, fear, happiness, sadness, frustration, anger, loss, hope, new meaning of life, which we just touched on. But the number one thing was around the uncertainty of not knowing what was coming next. And humans do not like uncertainty. We like to know what's up. You might have heard the term long-term effects and the long-term effects from treatment. And really what I'm referring to here are those individuals that may have had surgery and or chemotherapy and or radiation therapy. You may have gone on after that to have other medications prescribed to you, other types of treatment. But we're really focusing on sort of these three core areas of cancer therapy, and that they can lead to some long-term effects. We know that these effects can be physical or emotional in nature. I'll be touching on a few of them in a moment. We also know that they vary from person to person, and the severity of the effects can range from being mildly unpleasant to very severe for some. One of the quotes from the patients in the study said, "I guess I just assumed eventually I was going to start feeling better. Maybe a discussion would have been helpful only because it seemed very slow for me to get my energy back and to cope with the memory hiccups. I might have been less worried about that if I knew they were more common." And this is one thing that I heard over and over again from patients, is not knowing that what they were experiencing was actually what others were experiencing as well. And sometimes that was just enough to help them feel better. The common changes that people might experience after a cancer diagnosis and having gone through what can be in some cases 8 to 12 months worth of treatment, sometimes longer. Fatigue is one of the number one issues that people experience, and they might experience it months after treatment up to years later. There's a lot of different changes that go on within the bodies. For some, it's the frustration around the added weight gain that they cannot get rid of. For others, it might be the loss of a body part or some of the scars that they're experiencing from their surgery. Many talk about the tingling in the hands and the feet from having had a specific chemotherapy regimen and the frustration around that because they can't feel hot and they can't feel cold. Memory issues, one of the biggest things that comes up, and that frustration around the inability to concentrate, which I did note with many of the people that I saw, that it got better with time, but it was very frustrating initially. Those aches and pains that might come from having had treatment that you didn't have prior to. You might have issues with mobility, getting up and getting around that you didn't have before. Depression is certainly one of the side effects or long-term effects that may be felt. And for some, the fear of experiencing that large swollen arm and or leg from having had lymph nodes removed. Some do experience it, some never do, but some live in fear of getting that. Sexual health issues are one of the key areas that need to be discussed more openly with individuals and the impact that has with relationships. And obviously in a whole array of difficult emotions that are hard to manage. Now, I've gone through that whole list. I could spend an hour talking about how to best manage some of those symptoms or late effects that you might experience, but I'm going to sum it up in some key things. It really comes down to being as healthy as you possibly can be. Managing and obtaining a healthy body weight, that's through exercise and diet, which I'll touch on very briefly, drinking lots of water every day, getting back into a routine that works for you, planning the activities throughout the day that work best for you. If you're someone that suffers from fatigue, set up the activities that require the most energy first thing in the day, and then work towards the ones that require less energy later on. Report any changes you're experiencing to your family practitioner. That might be your family doctor, it might be a nurse practitioner that you're seeing. Brain games, that's good for anyone. The Sudoku puzzles, word searches, things like that are becoming very important. And don't be afraid to make lists and reminders for yourself to help remember things. Taking all medications as ordered and routinely is another key thing. and certainly talking to family and friends, letting your doctor know how you're feeling, and certainly considering further support and counseling if that's not enough. One patient talked about everything that happens in my life now, whether it's a mole that changes color, whether it's urine that suddenly looks different in the toilet bowl or smells funny, or, you know, it's like, that could be cancer, right? Canceritis is a real disease for sure, and you always have to keep it at bay. Now, what is she referring to with canceritis? She's referring to that fear of cancer coming back. From the moment you're diagnosed, throughout treatment, to the time you're told that you are no longer have cancer or are cancer-free, this is the #1 concern for all cancer survivors. That risk of cancer coming back or a new cancer developing is different for each individual. And it's likely that your cancer doctor, your oncologist, has talked to you about what your risk of cancer coming back might be for you specifically. I think it's important, and this is one thing I reassure patients all the time, you will be followed for the period of time in which your oncologist or your cancer doctor feels that they need to follow you and keep an eye on you. If they are talking about the notion of transitioning you back to your family doctor or your family nurse practitioner, that's because they feel confident in that your cancer risk is at a point where it's okay to hand you back to the family physician. When we talk about follow-up care, this is something that comes up all the time, and how important it is to maintain contact and to have a relationship with your family doctor. Regular follow-up visits are really important, even if you're not experiencing symptoms. We'll talk a little bit about the things you can be watching for and when to seek help, and that it's really important that you would be seeing your family practitioner more regularly will help manage these long-term effects you might be experiencing, help you monitor for any cancer recurrence that may happen, screen for other cancers. That's one aspect that we forget about, and I'll talk about in a moment, and also to ensure the mental and physical health and wellness within yourself. There's a lot of guidelines out there around proper cancer surveillance or follow-up, and the guidelines for family physicians and nurse practitioners to follow in terms of what needs to be done on an annual basis. And again, a lot of it ties to what your cancer diagnosis was and what your treatment was as well. One of the things I found most interesting out of the almost 500 patients that I've worked with over the last few years, many at the end of treatment and moving into that survivorship period did not fully understand what their cancer diagnosis was, nor what their treatment plan had been. And it's one thing that I think at any point it's important that you get this answered, that you find out the specifics around your diagnosis. Some know that they had surgery, but they don't know that they had lymph nodes removed or not. Some know they went through chemotherapy, but they couldn't tell you what the regimen was. There's just some key things that would be good for you to know and better understand moving forward. Of course, we've got records of all this, but for yourself. And what I would do is work through that with patients to help fill in the blanks for them with the parts they couldn't answer. When I talked about other cancer screening, what I will say is this is one of the #1 things that cancer survivors forget about. They've been very focused on the area of where they've had the cancer, that they forget that we still have to screen for the other key cancers that we can screen for as well. I'm seeing some guilty faces in the audience. And I'm not going to get into the specifics about what needs to be done for each of these, because that really is a discussion specifically with you and with your family practitioner. But not to forget that breast, cervical, and colorectal are the 3 key areas for other cancer screening. One of the #1 things I get asked are, what are the things I should be watching for? There's a lot listed here, and I'll talk about it momentarily, but the #1 thing is when there's anything that's different. And what I would do is send patients home, and I would say your homework for the next 2 days is to go head to toe and really take stock of what your normal is. For us, right hip pain is a normal thing, but when that hip pain becomes a different pain, or it's elsewhere in the body and it persists and lasts for weeks and weeks, that's something to get checked out. For others, certainly working with breast cancer patients, some patients have had very lumpy breasts for most of their life, and so the remaining breast, with all of its lumps and bumps, the important is getting to know that breast so that you know when something's different or something has changed. So any new lump or growth, any changes in the area where you originally had the cancer, any new pain that won't go away or new cough that won't go away. And my rule of thumb based on the literature was to say give everything 2 weeks. And obviously for 2 weeks, sometimes things can resolve. Sometimes they're a common cold, and sometimes they're things that need to be looked at. Persistent fatigue. This is this tiredness that just won't go away, a tiredness that is new, that you haven't experienced before. Unexplained weight loss or loss of appetite. Numbness in the arms or hands or in the legs and feet. If that is new, something different, you need to let your family practitioner know. And of course, the swelling along the side where you may have had lymph nodes removed in the leg or the arm is important as well. These symptoms do not necessarily mean that the cancer is back, but they mean that it's something that should get checked out if they're an ongoing issue for you. Healthy living and wellness, that's really the focus for all cancer survivors, as it is for those that have not been diagnosed with cancer. The goal is to try and remain cancer-free. And there's a lot of different ways, and again, this could be an hour talk on its own. I'm not going to say reduce stress based on Dr. Eisenberg-Grisetta's presentation, but certainly managing stress, recognizing those things that are causing unnecessary stress in your life that can maybe be mitigated. Going for the regular follow-up visits that I talked about. Stop smoking if you can. Minimizing alcohol intake. Protecting yourself from the sun and how important sun protection is for everyone. Be as social as you can be. I've talked to many patients that have really kind of isolated themselves after their diagnosis and their treatment. And talking to friends and family are so critically important. The two number one things that come up in every single one of these is exercise and diet. And it's the two that nobody wants to hear me talk about. We know what we're supposed to do. It's just so hard to do it. And eating well and exercise, I'm going to just touch briefly. Eating well, certainly anyone can talk to a registered dietitian and you can really specifically gear things yourself. There is the Canada's Food Guide, which just alerts you to the kinds of things you should be eating, how to manage your portions, and really maximize on getting all the nutrients that you need. And the one thing I want to highlight is healthy body weight is not always what we think it is. It's a conversation with your family practitioner around what is the most healthy body weight for someone like me, given what I've been through and where I'm at in my life. So that's an important conversation. The last thing is around exercise. Our Canadian government has outlined a couple years ago that we all need to be doing a minimum of 30 minutes per day. And I think what people don't realize is that can be 3 10-minute periods over the course of the day. You will get the same or similar benefit from that if 30 minutes is too daunting. And they want us to do that 5 times a week. I'm sorry I didn't put that there, but that's about 150 minutes out of an entire week that is deemed to be acceptable and certainly moving us forward in the right direction. And they want us to focus on our heart and getting that heart rate up. One thing that is always left off is strength training and how important that is. And I tell the patients, you know, grab 2 cans of soup out of the cupboard while you're watching Netflix and just start working those arms, because the strengthening of the muscles around the bone is what's going to keep that bone strong as well. Be sure to stretch daily. You can't ever go wrong if you start the day off with a good stretch, and look for ways to increase your physical activity. So I'm going to end on one other slide, and certainly this will be discussed at length through the evening, just around the resources that are available. I've listed some here. We've got the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, Gilda's Club of Greater Toronto. We've got the Canadian Cancer Society, Hearth Place, which is a cancer support center located out of Oshawa. We've got Wellspring, which we're fortunate enough to have on campus, and there's 3 other locations throughout the GTA. Unlockfood.ca is an excellent website, formerly known as Eat Right Ontario, that has great advice around diet. The Look Good, Feel Better program, which I believe is featured here tonight, as well as Wellspring. That's a picture of our own patient and education and research learning center that we have at Odette. And certainly if you're in the downtown core at Toronto General, there's the Elixir area that's designed for survivors as well. All of these resources that are available, and I've just named a few, all have aspects of their programming that are geared toward cancer survivors. And to the point where it might be a support group, it might be one-to-one peer support that they hook you up with. And for others, it might be literature and information that you choose to read on your own time or attend certain programs. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm a part of the panel after for questions. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Angela. Lots of good stuff. I'm going to leave 2 cans by my TV now. The only problem is lately, if I watch another Leafs games like the last 2, I might throw one on through my TV. So, anyways, on that note, last but definitely not least, our next speaker is Dr. Karen Fergus. This is another leader in our cancer program, and Karen certainly leads the activities of our psychosocial oncology, and we're just so happy to have her here tonight. She is a clinical psychologist and associate professor with the Department of Psychology, actually at York University. She's been practicing as a clinician here and a researcher at the Odette Cancer Center here since 1998. She works with all types of individuals and family members, and I think tonight she has a really great talk on a subject that we don't get to often enough, which is the relational aspects of cancer and caregiving. So on that note, I'm going to ask Dr. Fergus to come up.
Okay, whoops, that was loud. Well, thank you very much for coming out tonight. It's not a hospitable evening, and thanks for staying for the full extent of it. Yeah, so tonight I'll be speaking about the relational aspects of cancer and caregiving. And can you hear? You can't hear. Can you hear better now? Okay. Okay. Oh, I will speak into the mic. So I don't need to tell you all who are here, both as patients and caregivers, that cancer doesn't occur in a vacuum. And the way I think about this is that although the disease is, and don't feel free to holler again if you still can't hear me. Although the disease is located in one person's body, the illness is a shared experience among family members. And although a lot of my own personal research and my clinical work is focused mainly on individuals and couples, I think you'll know and find that much of what I'll be talking about tonight applies equally well to siblings, relationships between siblings, or between dear friends, or between adult children and their parents, and vice versa. Because relationships are everywhere. I'm going to start my talk with a quote by a marriage therapist by the name of Daphne Demarneff in the States. She says, "We depend on our bodies just as we depend on other people. And like other people, our bodies aren't entirely under our control. They let us down, they get sick, they die. What helps us face these realities is love." So what I'll be speaking about this evening is the power of our relationships and what the sociologists call our social capital. how we can leverage that not only to help the identified patient cope better, but also to help all the participants within the relationship system. So within the family, within the couple. And I'll be speaking to what we can do to move us in the direction of better outcomes and better relationships. And also by the same token, what we shouldn't do to ensure that we have better outcomes in our relationships. Now, every close relationship, essentially, I think of it as it's our own shared universe. In a way, all of our unique relationships are their own culture, they have their own language, idiosyncratic jokes, inside jokes, private rituals, sense of place. There's a collective memory that we share with our siblings, with our parents, with our partners. And we have this wonderful shorthand kind of information and way of reading each other exquisitely well because we know each other so well. And when families and couples are resilient, and you and I can talk a little bit about how we define resilience later, but we're drawing on that shared history and that insider knowledge as a way of helping us get through the difficult times. So in a way, while we're drawing on that knowledge that we've developed over a lifetime of knowing one another, essentially, and while handling the practicalities of our illness and the illness, we also never lose sight of what that means to us as a couple or as a relationship dyad. So as one man with prostate cancer said when he was first diagnosed with his disease, when he first heard the diagnosis, he said, I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't adjust. I went outside and I broke down and cried. But after I think about 3, 4, 5 days, logic began to kick in. And we said, well, let's find out what the hell we got here. We were hooked up to the net, and within 2 weeks, my partner and I knew more about prostate cancer than the average physician. Now, these are very engaged couple. They're information seekers, obviously. They're project-oriented couples that like to do things together. That was part of their relationship culture. So you see their culture coming through in how they're coping with the prostate cancer. But the other point I wish to highlight here is that the couple didn't anticipate becoming prostate cancer experts. That's the curveball they were thrown. And so the man's disease had to become their focus. And this is a kind of like a shift in a figure and a ground phenomenon that also happens when we must deal with serious illness. When things are moving along normally, we have a kind of like a luxury of not focusing on ourselves, on our bodies. We get to focus on the everyday life happenings, making the kids' lunches, or picking one another up after school or work, figuring out what we're going to watch on Netflix, those kinds of things, or maybe more broadly thinking ahead to our dreams and our goals as we move into the future. But sometimes we need to make ourselves the focus of our attention, and such as when the person, one of our loved ones, is ill. And this is a bit of a philosophical idea by a philosopher named Drew Leader, who talks about how, in a way, and I'll just speak to this, I won't read the quote in depth here, but he talks about this kind of paradox around how when we're well, we don't actually have to think. Our bodies kind of recede into the background. So I think about it, when we taste a strawberry or a piece of chocolate, we're not feeling our tongue on the chocolate, we're tasting the taste, the experience of the sensation of taste. Or when we're watching a slideshow or a movie, we're not feeling our eyes or experiencing our eyes. Our eyes allow us to enter into the world. And in a way, the body in this sense recedes. But then when we get ill, when we catch a virus, or when we get injured, or we accidentally cut ourselves, then we start to focus on our body. So our body becomes the center of attention in a way that generally we have a luxury of not having to do, if that makes sense. So I'm going to actually just illustrate Drew Leader's point with a whole other metaphor, which is driving down a beautiful country road. So let's just take a moment and imagine ourselves actually in Tuscany, where I had the good fortune to be last summer myself for a special birthday, which I won't go into the details of which. And while you're driving along and you're taking in the beautiful scenery, and this is like literally a patchwork of vineyards and olive groves and cypress trees, and you couldn't be more beautiful scenery. And as you're driving along, you have that awful sensation of kathunk. You know, that flat tire feeling? Or low tire? You hope it's a low tire, but it's actually gone flat. And so suddenly, we're now on the side of the road. That's not me, by the way. That didn't happen. It's a good thing. But we're on the side of the road, and we actually have to attend to the tire. Okay, so you see the difference here. Before I'm enjoying the scenery and life and all those wonderful things, and now I have to actually focus on the part that's broken, in this case, the tire. And so, you know, usually our bodies are the handmaiden to us, but now in these instances, we actually have to give our bodies some very specific focused attention. And although it's still a beautiful scenery in the landscape, it's just become a little less hospitable. And that actually is a rain shower in Tuscany. So although the tire or the broken part needs to be the focus, it's important to not lose sight of the relationship. And the need for things like clear and open communication, mutual support, although I don't think she looks all that supportive in this moment. She looks more annoyed. Attentiveness, and cooperation. So I want to talk a little bit about ways in which couples actually demonstrate resiliency. And this is actually a project of mine that I've actually been quite interested in couple resilience for a long time. And this idea that basically, what is it that allows couples to be resilient in the face of trauma, in the face of hardship? It isn't, in my view, again, Ellie and I can talk more about this, but it isn't about recreating what was, because to your point, Ellie, we can't step back in time. That's not realistic. That's not reality. But it's about moving forward in a way that basically allows us to have grown and understood and maybe deepened our experience better in some way. And so when Karen Scarrett and I finished a book, we did a book on couple resilience where we had asked contributors from all over North America to basically speak to, they were scholars and clinicians talking about various ways in which couples that they wrote chapters on basically different approaches to couple resilience and facing different kinds of adversities, not just cancer. But in the end, we were asked to write a chapter very basically distilled what it was about these couples that allowed them to be resilient. And so just to give you an example of some of the concepts here, mutual empathy came up, mutuality, mutual empathy, mutual vulnerability, that self-disclosure that we were talking about earlier, compassion, respect, an awareness of oneself and the other, and the relationship. Continually considering and prioritizing the relationship, building positivity into the relationship, having this backdrop of trust and mutual safety, drawing on that storehouse of accumulated knowledge and wisdom, so relational wisdom. Karen Scarrett talks a lot about relational wisdom in her work, and developing a unified meaning about the particular challenge. So in this case, it could be cancer. So there's a couple who I got to know in another project of mine. I had the privilege of knowing Janelle and Kareem. And this is a couple who went through breast cancer together when Janelle was not even 30. And they participated in a project of mine, which was an intervention for an online workshop for couples. And so it was sort of like an online course. And one of the exercises that we asked the couples to do in terms of on that line of creating a shared meaning of the experience was to develop a kind of like a creative expression of that, but to do it together. And so The couple actually came up with this wonderful poem, and I'll just read it through here. So the poem that they came up with, so this was before they actually were married. They experienced cancer. Although they already knew that all the things they would go through would be hard to overcome, it had only just begun. With a little lump inside her breast and hard beats inside his chest, with worry and uncertainty, but also strength, luckily. Because they learned a thing or two about what they could really do to fight the fight and work it out and see what it's all about, to love someone no matter what, without an if or and or but. With all they learned and taught themselves, they experienced wedding bells. Having gone through this ordeal, they knew that their love was real. And though marriage is give and take, for them it'll be a piece of cake. So I'm going to give you a few pillars of effective coping in close relationships. And one is actually making room for the illness. And it's a kind of an acceptance. It's not a giving over to it, but it's a type of acceptance that for now, the flat tire is flat. The tire is flat and has to be attended to. So the focus has to be on this to some degree. This is our job. And for as much as it's upended certain aspects of our life, we can't just fight it. We have to actually recognize and pay. It's basically commanding us to pay attention to it. Daphne de Marneff again talks about coping as akin to coping with an illness is like treating the illness almost like a third person in the marriage with its own demands, its own desires, its own disposition. And we need to make a space for that, for as much as we might not want to. Also drawing on your social capital, your social network, and it's come up a number of times already with Ellie and Angela. This is your broader network outside of that relationship system. So your extended family, your community, your religious organizations, such as your church or your synagogue or your mosque, mobilizing your support network, essentially. Retaining your sense of humor. Now this is an interesting point, and it comes up again and again with couples who are resilient. They will talk about this, and it's not a superficial making light of. It's actually drawing on, if you have that as part of your relationship, and in my experience as a couples therapist, I think many couples do draw intensively on their shared humor. It's that can often be a gallows humor or dark humor. But it's actually a very important point because it allows you to step outside of your respective roles as patients and caregivers for that brief moment, and you rise above what's occurring. And it's quite magical what can happen with humor. As one of my study participants said, the partner of a spouse, the humor gives us perspective. It really does. It shows us that this is not everything, that cancer is not everything, that there's more, that we're more. And so we can joke about it because it's still us and we're still here. Now, another project I worked on with Molly McCarthy, one of my graduate students, was on couples adjustment to living with an ostomy or colostomy. And one of the places where that showed was actually the humor came through in that because we discovered, we weren't expecting this, but couples actually name the stoma. And so, for example, a couple couples talked about Bob. We named him Bob. Another couple, her name is Bertha, Crazy Bertha. And so again, like that's a kind of a combo, right? You're making a space for it, recognizing that it is in a very kind of very literal way a third party in this relationship now, but it's also that use of humor because the humor allows that to not be so much. It's not pulling the couple down; they're actually rising above. And now I'm going to be, for the remainder of my talk, talking about this finding our rhythm as caregivers and receivers. And I prefer to think about what was supposed to be backgrounded, but that bouquet, think of it as a watermark. But becoming, I think of us, I prefer to think of patients and caregivers as givers and receivers of care. if that makes sense, because I think that is what's always going on, is this constant continual exchange. And if you think about it as a bouquet, you're giving the bouquet as care and you're receiving it, and what do you do as a receiver of the bouquet? And so it's actually quite a profound activity when you think about that, giving and receiving care. And what I think is important to bear in mind is that we're all, in all of our relationships, even though one person might be the focus or one person's body might be the focus right now, in all of our relationships, we're always switching off roles. We're always giving and receiving care. We're, not always, and so we can actually draw on that understanding in when we offer it. So when I'm offering care as a caregiver, I can actually draw on my experience as a patient or a care receiver and vice versa. And so we can help ourselves be better at our respective roles. So in giving and receiving care, sorry, just ahead of myself here a bit. So there are actually, we talk a lot about the differences in the two roles, but I'm going to talk about the similarities, because I think caregivers and care receivers and partners in relationships and family members, we're all dealing with a lot of similar feelings, such as loss of control, helplessness, anxiety about the future, fear of loss, grief, and feeling the need to be strong for the other person. Is that really common experience? And all of these will have implications for how we treat one another. All these feelings have implications for how we treat one another. And I'm going to just zero in on a couple of, after 20 years of this kind of work, I can tell you this comes up again and again in my practice and my research. It's kind of like a common pitfall, but sort of flip sides of the same coin, which is that both partners are feeling quite helpless in their respective ways. From the caregiver perspective, what this often leads to is a need to kind of take charge and tell the other person what they need to do. And so it might be to fix, to give advice, to somehow take control. On the patient perspective, there's an increased dependency, and a lot of us struggle with feelings of dependency. And then you get this wonderfully not so good dynamic between caregivers who are trying to take control and patients who are feeling very ambivalent about their increased dependency. And both of them are trying to be strong for each other. So the worst case scenario is you get a lot of lack of communication occurring because I'm trying to be stoic for my partner, my partner's trying to be strong for me. So I'm going to talk about how that dance of caregiving and care receiving, it could be a tug of war, but I prefer that it work out as a dance. Because there's some finesse involved, let's put it that way. So caregiving, I've already talked about the helplessness in the caregiving role. A common trap would be that I'm convinced that I know what's best for my partner or my loved one. So my parent, my sibling, my child, my adult child, I should qualify that. And what this often results in is this fix-it mentality, or what William Miller and Stephen Rolnick call the righting reflex. You want to set the other person right. That makes sense. And so this leads to a kind of advice giving. And sometimes this advice giving can be very obvious, like we're going to change our diet, we're going to do this regimen, we're going to restructure our whole lifestyle. And sometimes it can actually be quite subtle, like, oh, just think positively. Just don't think that bad thought. So you can get these little micro bits of advice. And sometimes actually the advice, I have to say, is well received and all flows smoothly from there. The good intent, but sometimes and often that kind of advice can actually end up backfiring. So rather than feeling effective as a caregiver and supported as a patient, we find ourselves in the midst of this tug of war. You can't see that title, but it's a very well-known theory in psychology called self-determination theory. Why does advice giving backfire so often? Well, there's a whole lot of research on that topic, and I'll tell you, and I'll try to summarize it in a nutshell by Ditzy and Ryan. We all have an intrinsic need to be autonomous and agential, and essentially to exercise our free will. And autonomy, that need for autonomy, it's deep-seated, to be self-directed, to be the architect of ourselves and our own lives. And competence, that feeling of competence is part of this, and also a relatedness, feeling the need to belong and mattering to others is part of this theory, but most importantly, I want to stress the autonomy component. And so we do this, we express our autonomy in countless ways, either by preparing meals, taking the dog for a walk, in our daily living, or through our self-expression, so how we wear, what we wear, the food choices we make, what we like to eat, what we don't like to eat, and then more deeply in our thoughts and our beliefs, what we want to believe, what we want to think, are all expressions of our autonomy. But the moment we're kind of told what to do, even nicely, that naturally will evoke an inner rebel, even if a part of us actually agrees with that is the best approach or the best choice. So give up smoking. Of course, there's every person who smokes. I'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who smokes who doesn't think that they probably should give up smoking on some level. But there's an ambivalence there. And so to start to tell somebody about giving up smoking, it's not so simple that they're necessarily going to make that choice because you've told them to. Because advice, however well delivered, can clash with our innate drive and desire for autonomy. So, how do we resist that righting reflex? First of all, trying to find that balance actually as caregivers, where we are between intervening when necessary, but also by not undermining our loved one's autonomy. And we want to think about providing support as a kind of a dance where you're moving in and out. Sometimes we lead and sometimes we follow. It's really important to not always lead, because in doing so, we're going to be undermining the other person's agency. And following entails some very important things as a caregiver: paying attention, being attuned, asking for what the other needs, being patient, breathe. For those of you who have elderly parents, you know what that's like to take your time. The other person may not be doing it. When someone's been through cancer treatment or exhausted from chemotherapy or radiation, those things that they can do, they're not going to be as efficient necessarily, but it's important that they do it. And in order for the patient to exercise, so that's out to that part. So care receiving, now we're going to look at the other side of the coin. So in order to be a good care receiver, we need to come to terms with our dependency needs. And I really want to stress that being dependent does not mean we're needy. Everyone in a relationship has dependency. We're interdependent, okay? Not independent all the time, and we're interdependent. Dan Weil, another relationship therapist, talks about this. He says, how dependent is that person is the wrong question. Everybody is dependent. The question is, how skillful is the person at being dependent? People who are good at being dependent don't even look dependent. They just look like engaging, appreciative, responsive, and loving people who are successful in getting you to want to comfort and take care of them. So care receiving also means expressing our needs directly. Don't make the mistake of expecting the other person to just know. They likely, if they don't just know, they don't know. So it's okay to express that directly. It's okay to be vulnerable and to be self-disclosing of that. Vulnerable does not equal weakness. Expressions of appreciation go a long way. In some of my research, the couples have expressed, the caregivers have talked about the same task, ounce for ounce, conducted. If the other person expresses sincere appreciation, it actually feels less burdensome on the caregiver. And if you feel like, oh, it's just not being noticed, it's just going by the wayside. Ounce for ounce, the exact same task. So it really really underscores the importance of the context and how it's received. And by the way, women are particularly bad at receiving care, in my experience. I can be challenged on that, but we're too used to being caregivers. So one of the things I want to just spend the last couple of minutes talking about is the importance of listening and learning how to listen attentively. And there's a whole lot of people who've written much better about, spoken about this, written about this. I'll be quoting one person on this topic in a minute, but basically I'd like you to start to think about when you're interacting with your loved one, as a patient or as a caregiver, to think about listening to understand rather than to just reflex respond. Truly listen, take a moment, pause. And this is an exercise that one of my mentors and colleagues, David Reed, talks about in his couples therapy work. Resist the temptation to be 2 steps ahead in your mind. Go ahead, presume you don't know, even though you know this person really, really well. Presume in that moment you don't know exactly what they're going to say. Allow yourself to be curious, even surprised. When you're listening attentively, no distractions, so put away your cellular devices far out of the way and make eye contact. You don't have to do this all the time, obviously. It'll be weird to do it every moment in all your relationships. But when you really want to, when you're listening attentively, think about that, making eye contact. Empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is putting yourself in that other person's shoes and responding from that place, as opposed to kind of pitying the person, which is really undermining their sense of agency. And I just would suggest, as a general rule, in all of your interactions with your loved ones, ask yourself, is what I'm about to say or do going to reinforce our relationship foundation or unnecessarily stress it? And if you just take a moment to ask yourself that question, you might find things go in a whole other direction, and hopefully in a better direction. So on the fine art of listening, Barbara Euland says, and you can look this up if you can Google her article, she's got a great article it's available online. Before going to a party, she tells herself she's going to listen with affection to anyone who talks to me, to be in their shoes when they talk, to try to know them without my mind pressing against theirs or arguing or changing the subject. No, my attitude is, tell me more. This person is showing me his soul.
Your attention, please. Your attention, please. May all units please retrieve an important message from the printers. Your attention, please. Your attention, please. May all units please retrieve an important message from the printers.
I just don't want to talk over that. Not that that's relevant. So lastly, I just want to say that after all this talk, this does not mean that we're not going to get other flats. But you will be better able, hopefully, to enjoy the ride more between the flats and discover new sites in between. So I'll show you some more wonderful pictures from my trip after the rain shower. And thank you all for your attention.
Wow. I was writing that stuff down. I'm going to try it on my kids first and the dog second. That was an amazing evening. Thank you to all our speakers. I'm going to ask them to come up now to the panel and for the real fun part of the evening. So hopefully you've started to work on some of the questions on the cards. And also, again, note, I'm so glad that this is webcast. So we can review it again. There's such a richness to the discussion that we've had tonight, and that I really, really appreciate it. All right. So just start to collect those cards. While we're collecting the cards, I'm going to throw a question out to the group here, and I'm going to start with you, Ellie. Rumination, you got a lot of attention with that word. So I guess I would start, I ruminate a lot, just as a confession, but I guess the question to you is, when do you know you need help? Like, when does the rumination, it leads to good things. I saw that on your slide. But when do you get what is a warning sign we could use to know that you're stuck in a rumination thing that you need some help to get out?
So look, that's a great question. This is, okay, can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So knowing when you're stuck on rumination, I think, I think we probably all ruminate to some extent. There are times when I might go home after a long day or a particularly challenging case, and I sometimes think about that at home, and maybe even ruminate about it and sort of dwell. I really like that we're dwelling on it, or thinking and just overthinking. The general rule in psychiatry is we start to worry about things when it becomes a disorder, when it becomes functionally impairing. And so there's worry, and then there's worry. And the idea is that there's nothing sort of inherently wrong or problematic or dangerous or troubling about worrying about things or about rumination if it doesn't impair somebody's ability to function. And so there are times when that worry might keep me up all night and might prevent me from falling asleep. And maybe that doesn't happen one night, but if that were to happen, let's say every night, night after night, and then I found myself unable to think clearly and function well during the day, that's when it would really be a problem. That's when kind of beneficial or adaptive process would lead to dysfunction, lead to a problem in somebody's function.
Andrew, I'm going to go to you next, and we're going to change up. This was a really interesting question. So how do you differentiate between fatigue and sort of being depressed, that sort of persistent tiredness after your treatments? How do you differentiate that from a symptom of actual cancer? Sorry about that. Usually I don't have a problem with it, so okay. How do you differentiate between like a fatigue or depression that might just be from everything you've been through? Like, how do you differentiate that from a sign of cancer coming back, and what advice would you have for people to sort of deal with it?
Yeah, so that's not a particularly easy question. I think it does differ for individual to individual. Again, one of the things I mentioned is it was really important to let each patient know that they really needed to take stock, as I mentioned, of their body, their norm, and what's going on. So if being fatigued a year or two following your cancer treatment is what has been normal for you at the time that we're having our conversation, or you may be leaving the cancer center and moving back to your family practitioner, that's an example of something that may have been your norm. You may have even been somebody who had low energy prior to being diagnosed with cancer, and certainly getting through the treatment has made it worse. It's knowing that when all of a sudden it's changed and it's become different. So it's become more persistent. It's actually now interfering with your ability to get up and get through your activities of daily living. And that goes for any of the symptoms I've gone over. Many of the ones I talked about might be things we're already experiencing before we're diagnosed or undergo treatment. The key is, when do they seem to be different, seem to be more than normal? Certainly, I don't want to speak to depression when I'm sitting between a psychiatrist and a psychologist. But again, some people go into a cancer diagnosis already having suffered from depression their entire life. And the key becomes, does the cancer diagnosis and the treatment exacerbate that depression? Does it stay the same? And noting when it's starting to really impact things in your life that it didn't do before. Unless anyone has anything to add on that.
No, I think the questions also have, like, that's a very internal sort of question. Then there's an external question, Karen, I'm going to go to you, but it was a very simple one. empathy. How they were asking for, how can one improve on empathy? Now I'm going to listen really hard because I got to go talk to the kids after. No, but I'm serious. But
That's such a great question. Wow. I mean, just to say, I teach classes in counseling. It's like they're beginner graduate students who are becoming psychologists, and we spend a whole year learning how to be empathic and convey empathy. One thing I'll just say is that there's a difference between feeling empathetic and expressing empathy. And most people understand or experience the feeling of being empathetic. To express empathy takes another step. And the best way I can suggest it or think of it is for you to think about, if I was in that person's shoes, what would the impact of that experience be on me at that moment? And then from there, draw from that and offer something back to the other person. So if somebody is talking about, I don't know, the feeling of being overwhelmed or in a crowded place and feeling quite overwhelmed, just thinking off the top of my head, I'm actually imagining myself in a crowded place. And then from there, offering out something that would reflect the empathy that I'm feeling as I'm imagining myself in that person's position. I think I'll stop.
So actually, maybe just to kind of piggyback on that, so maybe that's a great example. So to use your example, so if you were in a crowded place, I would imagine that that would feel sort of overwhelming or scary, so when I teach psychiatry residents and not for a year on how to develop further, kind of develop their empathy, so little tips and tricks that I'll sometimes give them are, if you're thinking about a statement that starts with "at least," it's probably the wrong statement. So the idea is that I would say, well, so to be in a crowded place, wow, that must be really overwhelming or scary, and I would resist the urge to say, but at least you have somebody there with you.
Mm-hmm. To take the to make it better somehow. And I like that actually. Another tagline is "sounds like." So you offer up a sound. It sounds like it must feel like it sounds like it could be quite overwhelming for you. It sounds like it's very difficult to be in that position, because the sounds like invites correction. So that in case you're a little bit off, it's not that you have to be accurate all the time, but it's that you're inviting. Think about the empathic reflection as an invitation for them to further define or describe what they're going through.
Great. There's another concept that I'm going to put to you guys, and I'm going to start with Ellie first, and then I'm going to move on because there's a little twist to this, but it's the concept of fear. I think I get this one, where I love your talk from the point of trying to find that post-traumatic growth, but where does that fear of cancer occurrence? Do you have any advice how to work with that to turn it into something that you can deal with?
Well, so look, I mean, it's. I'm going to echo Karen's statement from before, which is that this is, these are tough questions. So something like fear of cancer recurrence, there are entire workshops, seminars, and support groups that are dedicated to looking specifically at how to help people manage fear of cancer recurrence. The advice that I give to people, if that's what they're asking for, typically involves, trying to normalize what the experience is like. And, what that means is basically helping people understand what to expect. And, unfortunately, at the beginning at least, fear of cancer recurrence is something big and real. And I wouldn't go as far as saying it's always unavoidable, but it's often there. And it's there at least to some extent. And so often what I'll do is I'll actually sort of paint a bit of a roadmap for people about what to expect in the way of actually experiencing that fear or that worry of cancer occurring. and the fact that it does tend to get a little bit better with time, and that it tends to spike again when people have other health concerns that come up, or like Angela was saying before, when they feel certain physical sensations in their body, sometimes around the time of tests, blood tests, or imaging like CAT scans or MRIs. And so sort of painting a roadmap for people sometimes allows them to, it's a way of avoiding insult to injury. The injury is that this is unfortunately something that lots of people experience, but it's a way of avoiding the added stress or distress of thinking that there's something abnormal about feeling worried in the way that many people do.
So a twist to throw to Angela next is that, particularly in my other role as a cancer surgeon, I think one of the problems we do is we keep testing people after, and there's every single test. I think there's a fear of I've always told my patients that my dream scanner is the one that scans you when you don't know in the middle of the night. You wake up with yellow sticky and it says, hey, everything's okay. So, but until we get to that dream, what you end up doing is you have a test, and then it's really probably 2 weeks of torture. Ange, do you have any sort of practical things you can give advice to?
I would say that's one of the misconceptions I think that people have once they've gone through cancer treatment and are certainly moving into that post-treatment phase. There's almost an expectation that they are going to get more tests and more blood work and more images done than they're actually going to get. For example, with the breast cancer patients that I dealt with, they were shocked to hear that we were only going to do the mammogram once a year. And why would we be doing it every 6 months? What if it comes back and you miss it because you haven't done it more routinely? And I think the understanding around that you don't need necessarily to go looking for things as well. Finding that balance, it's very, very hard for individuals. I think the education about what to expect regarding that helps people. I was going to say, with all of this fear that we're talking about, I think the number one thing is having information about what's coming next makes people less fearful. I talked about that uncertainty, and certainly being able to kind of lay that out for what the next year is going to look like, what the follow-up, what to expect. That's a whole other slide I didn't put in that I do talk with patients. What to expect when they go to their family physician, what to expect in the first 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year following. Just knowing that and understanding that that's what the routine imaging and testing looks like and other people are doing, that helps people a lot. So I think having some, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but certainly having knowledge of what to expect and why we don't need to do it more often is important.
And then, Karen, to take something from Ellie's talk and throw it at you, and this is a tough one, but what if the caregiver feels that they've been just as traumatized or traumatized in a different way? I know it's always hard for you to answer this in a brief way, but maybe some advice or strategies for the caregiver to deal with that trauma that they might not even feel that they should have, consider.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Because I do think that there, as in any relationship, we can't fulfill everything to each other at all times. And when one person is more vulnerable, it may not be your partner, the person who's in the patient position. It might not be the best person to work through a process or traumatic experience or your traumatic feelings or your deepest worries with. It's a balance. I'm not suggesting that you don't share on some level, but there's sometimes I think it's also important to have resources and people outside of the relationship to speak to. So, I mean, that's just anxiety. I think if you're talking more in the realm of trauma, and I think that's a really good point, Calvin, that I really do see this as sort of bookends of the same trauma with couples especially. Definitely seek out your own supports. Don't hesitate. Most cancer programs, ours and others, have psychiatry, psychology, social work on staff to help you with processing some of those components of the experience. So yeah, just not to hesitate to reach out to others in general as the caregiver, for sure.
Now that we've warmed up, I've got a really hard question for you. This is one of the things I love about the cards that I give is that people challenge us with things that are hard. And Ellie, there's something I know about you, which unfortunate for you means that I know that you have given amazing talks on this, and it's going to be hard to give a full answer tonight on this. But I've got this question about really somebody trying to help a friend who has been diagnosed with, let's say, a terminal cancer, whatever that means. It could be a long or short, but they're asking about medical assisted dying. And so how do they help? What advice would you give for that person to help the other person explore that difficult issue? And then maybe while you're answering, we can get perspectives from Angela and Karen as well.
So you're right, this is a topic that I've talked about a lot, and I've been somewhat involved with at this hospital. You know, love it or hate it, medical assistance in dying is legal now. It's decriminalized for certain individuals who meet certain criteria. As of June 2016, there's been a law in place in Canada. So, you know, I think in reference to this question, there's sort of the kind of maybe the short answer, the concrete answer, which is if people are interested in this and they want more information, it's actually quite easy to find information about it online. I think the maybe longer, more nuanced answer, the one that kind of draws on a lot of what's been talked about already tonight, is the idea of empathy, actually, and trying to understand what it is that friend might be going through in a way that, you know, depending on the background of the person who wrote the question, I mean, in a way that that individual may or may not feel capable of doing, may or may not have had similar experiences. And so I think when it comes to trying to understand what somebody's going through in a sort of caring, but really empathic way, many of the tips that Karen had given about how to listen, truly actively listen, and ask the questions that are coming from a place of curiosity, one that you know, doesn't feel like it's a place of needing to answer and problem solve, would be the way to do that. And so, simply put, if somebody in a similar situation were to ask me, what I would say, maybe the first question I would ask would be, tell me more what you're thinking.
So, who makes the decision for medically assisted? Does the patient make the decision, or does the doctor make the decision?
So, so it's the patient's decision. A patient has to sign paperwork.
Okay.
It has to be witnessed by two independent witnesses, hopefully somebody who's not, you know, the beneficiary of that person's will, for example. But it does have to be, eligibility has to be confirmed by two clinicians, whether a physician or a nurse practitioner. Eligibility has to be confirmed by two clinicians, but it's the patient's own decision, and the first step always is going to be the patient has to actually make a request.
I was just going to highlight how brave it must be for an individual and how courageous to actually bring that up. And I think understanding that just coming from a place of even being able to ask that question of a friend, it's hard at that point, depending what your feelings are around medical assistance in dying in terms of how you respond. I think the key is the active listening, and as Ellie said, being very curious. I think in the essence of feeling you need to do something when someone brings that up, it may be that it's, could I help to get more information around that for you, just to see what's involved and see what it is that they're wanting to know specifically around that. They may also be wanting to see what your feelings are around that topic as well. That's a tough one, but I have to remark how great it is for someone to actually bring that forward.
I'll just add, because I'm not the expert, Ellie is, on this topic, that I just can't help but just also think about compassion, this idea of compassion in relationships, and being a caregiver or a loved one to somebody who's considering me is just, it asks so much of the loved ones.
Your attention please, your attention please. Code white C Charlie 5. Your attention please, your attention please. Code white C Charlie 5.
He's always on, just this timing is impeccable. The compassion piece, and also I just want to say that, where was I?
How difficult it is for loved ones.
How difficult, yeah, I know how difficult it is, and it really is almost the biggest gift I think one can give is to listen to what would be the most difficult conversation I think any family member would have with another family member. So.
Great, those are really tough questions. Just going to lighten it up for a second with a little, and then we've got another good question coming up. I just got this question, which maybe I'll field a little bit first, and then I'm going to throw it to Angela. The question was, how and by whom are cancer patients and their caregivers informed of these support services and others that are available for them to access at Sunnybrook? So just as a commentary, I don't know that we've got it right yet, but I know that some of you who come and visit and fill out our symptom screening form, it gives you this printout. And I know that there was a time we used to tell you to give the printout to your doctor or your nurse, but actually, if you look at that printout now and flip it over, all of our resources are on the back there. And what we're meaning to do now, and we're trying to explain this more, is that the printout is for you to see how you're doing so that you can see where maybe you're not doing so well, that you can flip it over and look at the services that you might be able to call on with phone numbers and contacts for each of those. And do I have that right, or is there anything else we should know?
Well, given that I'm a nurse, I'm going to plug nursing. I think it's important for everyone, certainly wherever it is that you're being cared for, you've been cared for, or in any realm of healthcare, that you ask about nurses being available to you in the moment. I think there's a lot of opportunity for nursing to help highlight some of the resources that are available. Certainly, the physician, the nurse practitioner in the practice might have some idea as well, and certainly if you get directed to a registered dietitian or an occupational therapist or a social worker or a physiotherapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, whoever it might be, they can certainly then further alert you to some key resources. But certainly I can say that at the Odette Cancer Center, the nursing team has access to a lot of written information they can provide for you. They can direct you to our Patient Education and Research Learning Center on the main level of our cancer center. And then also what's available to people in the community. And again, I highlighted, I really did focus on community because at the point of certainly moving into the survivorship phase, what's available to you in and around your home is probably of key importance. But certainly to ask anybody in your healthcare team, and I think the language to use is just around, are there any support resources available for me here or anywhere, out in the area of the city.
So the last card, I think, I wasn't sure, it says comment more than question, but it's an awesome comment because I certainly, in my own family and my own cancer experiences, means a lot to me, so I'm just going to read it out. If I identify more as being resilient than experiencing post-traumatic growth, are you saying I've somehow missed out on the good or silver lining of having cancer? Wow, that was a lot. I thought that would be good to end with, so maybe I'll start. We'll torture Alex first.
Yeah, so look, it's a great question. So I don't know that it's either or, and that idea that resilience sometimes actually buffers against experiencing trauma to a severe enough extent that one can develop post-traumatic growth following that. So where that comes from is large studies that have been done. And so the way these studies are done is, basically researchers identify folks who've been through cancer or traumatic events and ask them if they want to participate, and then usually give them surveys to fill out afterwards. And then they take all of the survey responses, they aggregate the data together, and they make fairly broad conclusions based on the numbers that they look at. The way in which that applies to one given individual is not a whole lot, typically. And so it's not to say that for any one experience, those sort of broad characterizations of the process are going to apply to one specific individual. So those are trends, basically, that are seen. Does it mean that there's been some loss, or maybe that you might have missed out on the silver lining? Look, I don't know. And if there was a missing out, I don't know that it was because of having a resilience to begin with. What we know is that post-traumatic growth is a process that evolves over time. I mentioned, it can take months or years, and there isn't sort of an end date where one can then say, I've now experienced post-traumatic growth and I'm through it. And so it's an ever-evolving process. And it's not one that everybody experiences. It's one that many people experience. But it's an experience that I think, I almost never hear somebody say, therefore I'm glad that my cancer happened. And I have heard that. And usually I think I've heard that from folks who have this sort of defensive need to pretend like it was a good thing. It's not a good thing. I've never heard anybody say that it's a good thing, and that if it happened again, they would have wanted it to happen again. But it's given that it happened, is there some way to have grown from it? And the answer is yes. Sometimes it's possible, and sometimes it happens, and sometimes it doesn't. But certainly, it's something to to strive towards if if there's a way for that to happen.
Yeah, and I would say also just to think resilience and post-traumatic growth aren't mutually exclusive. So I think it's possible. It depends on how you're defining resilience. So if you think of resilience as it didn't happen, or it's I'm still the same person I absolutely was before my tragedy or my injury or in this case cancer, then that's a kind of like a denial. So that's not really true resilience in my view. True resilience is acknowledging the reality that you've been through and finding a way to move forward. And then there is this, I think, meaning-making component, and I guess the depths to which one goes with that will determine to what degree, I guess, a person feels like they've come out with a more expanded purpose or more meaningful life questions. But I don't think we have to necessarily think of resilience and post-traumatic growth as opposite. It's how you define resiliency.
I'd like to ask a panel question. I'm curious regarding the fear that everybody's feeling here. Nobody's really addressed that. If a person going through cancer tests on a regular basis, how does one control continuing anxiety and fear when one has to face every 3 months, every 6 months, or every year? And this one question that needs to be addressed because it affects everyone's lives. So I'd like to respond to all three of these because this is really to the core of how to deal with cancer or a major illness. How do you go on, how do you control fear, continual testing, waiting for results, biopsies, chemo, etc., etc.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So look, it's a great question. It comes up. I mean, like you said, all the time, and I think most people probably think about this and experience it. I don't think the goal is ever to get rid of the fear. I don't think it's realistic. I think the goal is to, meaning all the fear, I think the goal is to figure out a way to live life meaningfully and purposefully, in spite of the fear and the worry that certainly gets aggravated more around tests and procedures and surveillance visits. But the idea isn't that it's one or the other. It's how can people learn to live a life that still has meaning and purpose in spite of the fear that might still be there.
That's a question I think that really cuts to the heart, so thank you for raising it. And I agree so wholeheartedly, everyone knows this in this room, that probably the worst experience, I don't have an answer actually for how to get through the testing. I've always come up empty-handed. I just think you just get through it, and you do whatever you need to do to get through it. It could be an event, it could be a distraction, many distractions. I do think that there are peaks and valleys though, and I think you find that point at which you can take a stand and you're not totally consumed by your fear. And I think that happens. It's a learning curve, and everyone finds that way in a way on for themselves, but with the resources that are available. So drawing on the support system that you have, but also there's a lot of amazing programs out in the community. Wellspring offers tons of programs such as mindfulness training, relaxation training. So you can access these services. The Healing Journey is an amazing program that deals with both how to handle anxiety and fear, existential distress, and meaning making. And it is a very individual journey in that sense. But I appreciate the question. I'm not sure I have the best answer for it.
I'm again not sure how much more I can add to that. I think one of the things that I've certainly shared with patients is around the time that they're coming back for a follow-up visit, they're getting a test, they're identifying that is a fearful period. I've asked them to write down the questions that they want to ask, that if they could ask in that moment, that would alleviate the fear, to write them out. Some come up with 3 questions, some have 12 questions. And they have to be questions that you're able to pose to your healthcare practitioner. Again, I want to alert that, again, at ODET, I don't know where if everyone's here has been to ODET or elsewhere, but again, asking about the nursing team that's available to speak to leading up to the testing. We recognize that that's a high distress period, that certainly just talking it through and talking about what to expect can certainly help. And then I think a question always is, how much more of this testing am I going to be going through? And I think what's really helped is when people know what that testing pathway looks like over the next year. I'm not saying it's going to mitigate what happens when the time comes around to have the test, but certainly sort of stepping back and asking, what am I so fearful of? Is it a recurrence? Is it a progression? Is it a new cancer that might be found, or are the obvious ones? Sometimes it's around the test.
the MRI, the CT. There's a lot of anxiety with those tests as well. And we recognize that, so.
Whew. I want to just finish up because our time is at an end, but I want to thank our 3 speakers tonight to take on something that's really complicated and heavy, and to do it in this open forum is an amazing thing. So thank you. So just a few last housekeeping. Our panel will be here for a few minutes, not too long. They've got families to go home to, but they will be here if you have any further questions you want to ask in person. Please fill out your evaluations and pass it to the volunteer. And also, of course, don't forget your free parking pass before you leave. And that same volunteer you give the evaluation form also holds your free parking passes. Updates are at sunnybrook.ca. And again, thank you, good night, and a safe drive home.